just listen to the Republicans.
Well, let's try to hear what happened.
Exercise. It's for Article 1.
All right, lecture 11.2. We're coming up on the last few substantive topics within the semester. I wanted to talk today a little bit more about this process of resolving differences between the House and the Senate, trying to understand it, and in particular, focusing on how it is that scholars and students of Congress like me think about this process. Okay, let's get started. So the scholarly and academic questions that we think about here have to do with who has a bargaining majority within the House of Representatives and within the Senate, and inside this negotiation between what the Senate wants and what the House wants. There's this analogy that I've made a few times this semester, that legislation is like a box. So legislators, when they're thinking about creating new policy, they start off with this empty box and they fill it up with tools that address particular policy concerns. Those policy concerns could be addressed by any variety of tools, like a compass, say, or a wrench, tape measure, hammer, pair of pliers, screwdriver, I think. I don't know how many tools I put in here. It all depends on what I had in my clip art folder when I made this slide. All right, so we fill up this box with a bunch of tools that address it. And Chamber I, whichever chamber that is, could be the House, could be the Senate, Chamber I creates this box and fills it up with all these tools. Well, then Chamber J comes along and says, this is a great set of tools. They send it to, and it's interesting, we've talked about how this thing gets filled up, right? So, someone comes along and says, here's a box that we need to fill up with tools. They go into committee and they hash it out. The committee then reports it to the floor, doesn't report it to the floor. There's processes that we can get this to move along. But what is inside that box is a function of the dynamics of Chamber I. Chamber J comes along after Chamber I has acted and is like, this is a great set of tools to address these policy concerns. And we like all of this, except we don't like the crescent wrench. Let's pull that out. And let's change that to a pipe wrench. And I think that's what these are. I know the one on the left is a crescent wrench, and the one on the right, I think, is a pipe wrench. You can correct me if I'm wrong. People have corrected me on this in the past. All right, so they've changed it, right? The Constitution requires that for this box to become the law of the land, for these policies to be enacted, every element of it has to be the same in Chamber I and Chamber J. And so the problem, of course, is that some elements of this are not exactly the same. They're both wrenches, but they are wrenches that are used in different ways and for slightly different reasons. So because these two things are different, this box can't become law. It's a bill, and we've got to resolve these differences. And the question is, how do we do this? And I suggest that there's a few questions that we might want to think about. And when we started talking about procedures within the House and within the Senate and being really focused on that, this has been kind of the central question. Why is it that Chamber J only changed that wrench? So that's one. So why is it that the Senate comes along and is like, well, we like lots of this, but there's things we want to change. Why is it that they're different? In other words, why does the House end up with a different box than what the Senate box has, even in these minor ways? Why is it that the House and Senate arrive at different conclusions and at different policy solutions? And then the other thing we want to know is not only why are the House and Senate different, and we've talked about why these processes are different and how they differ in practical terms, but we also want to know, what is it at the end of the day? What is it that they do? What gets thrown into the bill, and which wrench is it that we end up using to solve the policy problems that Americans face? All right, here are some answers, and these are going to be very political sciencey answers and very limited. And I think we want to think about what each of these might mean. So one answer might have to do with the partisanship of agenda setters in either of these chambers, right? So it may be that Democrats love crescent wrenches and Republicans like pipe wrenches. So when they're trying to resolve these differences, they're trying to figure out what's which of these we ought to see. And so one argument might be that when we have Democrats in charge in both the House and the Senate, or Republicans in charge in both the House and the Senate, there's going to be more agreement on the kinds of wrenches that should end up in the box. Another answer about why we end up with, and so that might tell us about why we get some disagreement, right? That it's not just about the processes, it's about the goals of the legislators within the chamber. Setting aside some of these internal institutional dynamics. Another argument might be that these internal institutional dynamics matter a lot. So for example, if the filibuster gives the Senate outsized power because it says, look, it's not enough for the majority to just get what they want. We've got to satisfy a minority in the Senate as well. Does that give them additional bargaining leverage? And the bargaining leverage then should change as the Senate majority shifts and becomes bigger and bigger and eventually maybe subsumes the filibuster. If the House majority and the Senate majority are not the same, but there's a large Senate majority, we end up with less agreement. So thinking about the dynamics within the House and the Senate helps us kind of arrive at a set of expectations about what kinds of outcomes we would expect from any one of these chambers. So, do you get a crescent wrench or do you get a pipe wrench? But also questions about when we sit down and try and resolve these differences, who wins? Who has more leverage? Another idea here is that policies are, and this if you go off to policy school or get an MPA, they sometimes focus on this question of policy complexity. And policy complexity is that, lots of policy complexity means that it's easier for people to disagree. There's just more nuance. And so, if it's not a wrench, but like engines, right? There's lots of ways to tweak engines. Wrenches are relatively simple. And then there's this other question about the institutional dynamics, not just within Congress, but between Congress and the president. And so if your chamber is aligned with the president has a lot of sway. He's got this veto that can block anything. And if you can lean on the president and say, look, give us what we want, or the president's going to veto it, that might give your chamber additional influence on this process. All right, so in practical terms, how does this work? When we go through this legislation, we want to determine which chamber has influence. We want to determine what we get. We need to break bills down, and we need to think about them in their components. And remember that components of the bill that we talked about, we can list them off, right? In the example I gave you, we had that compass, and we had a tape measure and a hammer and some pliers and a screwdriver. And those are in both versions of the bill from the chamber I and from chamber J. All right, so we see both of those, but then there are a couple of things that are only in chamber I and only in chamber J. Now, one of the things that you should observe here is that policies and solutions to policy problems, to things we see in the world, are ideas. They're concepts. And the thing about these ideas and concepts is, we can't articulate ideas and concepts in their fullest and complete form. So when we say, healthcare is an issue, we need to resolve it. We need to help people get more healthcare and better healthcare. And we need more people to have healthcare. It's not enough to have that idea. We've got to figure out a way to articulate it and to put that into practice. And the way that we do that, and I mean, there's a whole philosophy around this elsewhere, but we're gonna use a poor man's version of this. We have to encode ideas into language. So legislation is written. It's a written document. This is why lawyers work for members of Congress and work all over the Hill and get into politics in the first place. They're good at writing down and encoding these kinds of ideas in language. So when we convert the list of policies into language in this hypothetical, very imagined example, we can turn all of those objects into words. And now it becomes possible for us to compare the language that we use to describe these policy solutions in very direct ways. So for example, everything lines up between these two bills, except not just the things that are both in I and in J, but also elements of what's different in I and J, right? So the only two things that are different in this list of policies are the crescent and the pipe, right? They're both wrenches. Everything else is the same, exactly the same, but the crescent and the pipe components are different. So we can then start to get an idea about how to distinguish between the policy solutions that members of Congress are offering. In practice, this allows us to think about this question of who wins, who gets more of what they want. I want to spend the balance of our video today talking about how it is we go about trying to measure that and get at that. To understand this question of who wins, we have to engage in a very tricky process in social science that we call measurement. How do we take these abstract ideas and try and measure them in people and in social processes? So you can take entire, and if you went off and got a PhD in political science, you take entire classes on this issue of measurement. Psychologists, economists, sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists have these big, long, deep, very developed theories and ideas about how it is we measure things. I want to step back from that and just talk to you about how we might do this in practice. And the way that we might do this in practice is using a relatively recent development, something that all of you and all professors are familiar with, and that is plagiarism software. So we're going to use plagiarism software to compare House versions and Senate versions of bills, and we're going to focus for just a moment on the text of important bills. So the first version passed by the House and the first version passed by the Senate, and then compare that to the final version that we get. Now, plagiarism software is going to give us 4 proportions. It's going to tell us what of the first version of the bill from the House and Senate is alike and what's different. That's what plagiarism software does, is it takes you, if you turn in a paper that's plagiarized, it goes through that and then it compares that to a bunch of other documents to see if any of the language in your paper comes from someplace else or is exactly the same as language from someplace else. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, did the House or the Senate plagiarize each other? That's that center column of things that are the same. And what is different then? And then we can take those things and we can compare what's different to the final version and see who got more of their unique contribution into the final version of the bill. That will tell us something about who wins. So we can figure out what proportion of Chamber I's text is in the bill that is sent by that is not in the Chamber J's bill. We can also figure out the intersection. So how much of one chamber's bill is also in the other chamber's bill. So we get these ideas. So plagiarism software says what is the same and what is different, how much is the same and how much is different. And we're going to take the legislation and run it through both the House and Senate versions of bills and run it through plagiarism software and compare where they overlap and where they're different. We can do this in reverse. So we do this for Chamber I and we can do this for Chamber J. We can do this for the House and we can do this for the Senate, and for the House. And then we can compare them to the end. So what do we get ultimately out of this process? So which wrench gets thrown into the final bill? Well, we're going to figure that out by looking at, if we take all of the text, imagine all of the text for the House bill or Chamber I's bill is here in this blue square. And all of the text from Chamber J or the Senate's bill is in this red square. And we look at those two and we compare that to the final version of the bill. So some third or final version. Now you can see this triggers a set of regions. So there's some stuff that's like, this looks like a stealth bomber up here. This is language that is in neither the House nor the Senate version of the bill. There's a bunch of stuff. This hockey stick here is stuff that is unique to the House bill, but the toe of the hockey stick is a unique contribution to BK. And the same is true here. We've got a square and there's a hockey stick with a toe that is stuck inside of BK. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that was in both the House and Senate version of the bill, this L here, that ends up not in the final version of the bill. But there is this core set of things, and for the purposes of this illustration, it's relatively small, but generally speaking, it's really big. It's most of BK, and it's most of BI, and it's most of BJ. And so this core set of policies is something that the House and the Senate agree on and end up in the final version of the bill. What we want to know, if we're trying to figure out who wins, is which chamber makes the largest unique contribution to the final version of the bill. Does it mostly come from the House bill or Chamber I's bill, or does it mostly come from Chamber J's bill? So these squares, what we want to do is we want to compare the size and the content that comes from the bills that are House and Senate bills that are unique to the House and Senate, and look and see who gets the bigger or the greater proportion in the final version of it. So back to this question of who wins. We can run it through the statistical software. We can figure out who gets the most language, who encodes the most policies in the final version of the bill. That will tell us who wins at the final stage. So one of the things that we know after doing this analysis is that the chamber's alignment with the president. So if you're the Senate and you're aligned with the president's party, you end up getting more in the final version of the bill. That's interesting and maybe not surprising given what we know about the president's veto power. If the reverse is true, that the House is aligned with the president and the Senate is not, then the House gets more of what it wants in the final version of the bill. That's interesting. So being aligned with the president gives you an outsized amount of influence in the legislative process. That tells us something about executive influence in the legislative process. Something else that we realize is that when the House is a first mover, so it's the first to introduce legislation, it ends up getting more of what it wants into the final version of the bill. There's an increase in the amount of House encoded policies when they're the first mover. When the Senate is the first mover, they don't get the same kind of advantage. That's a puzzle. Why is that the case? Why is moving first better for the House than it is for the Senate? There's no effect. It's not like they get less. They just, bills where they move second or bills where they move first, there's no difference between the two. But if the House moves first, they get a lot more. That means that the House is like, great, we'll move first. We're going to go. Some of this might be due to the fact that a lot of the stuff the House moves first on is really large and complex. It's appropriations legislation. And so all appropriations and tax legislation start in the House. Those are big, complex bills. They end up getting a lot more because they just start off first. And it's so complex that a lot of this negotiation happens ahead of time. Another thing that we see when we compare, these bills in plagiarism software is that when we compare the House and Senate bills to the final version of the legislation, that when bills get sent back and forth multiple times or go through this conference procedure, so we go through these multiple passages back and forth of shuffling amendments, the Senate is really advantaged. It ends up getting more of what it wants. That could be due to the filibuster, right? So they're like, look, we're negotiating, give us more or we're going to get filibustered. Give us more, we're going to get filibustered. We need to have it this way because that's what gets us around this minority obstruction. It is certainly the case that we see the Senate doing better when there's ping-ponging. Last but not least, there are lots of unanswered questions here. So you think about what professors do with their time. When I'm away from you, during the pandemic, I'm off teaching third grade math. But when I'm not teaching third grade math, I'm thinking about some of these unanswered questions. Like, why is it that we get, I go back and I look at this shape, trying to explain, the size and the relative size of each of these regions. And I'm really concerned about why is the stealth bomber a lot bigger in some bills than others? Why is it that they move, this final version could really move far away from what was originally in the bill that was introduced in Chamber I, then amended in Chamber J? Other times, we move this stealth bomber shape is a lot smaller, and it may only have a wing it may only have wings in certain places in certain spaces. So thinking about those different shapes and the size really of those shapes is something that I spend a lot of time on in my research life. Thinking about how bicameralism shapes and reshapes and distorts possibly what goes into the legislative process. So those unanswered questions are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. It's a big chunk of my day, every day, thinking about those shapes. The last thing I want to say about this, because thinking about who has more influence, the House or the Senate, is a big deal. And I said that I'm interested in that stealth bomber shape that is part of that negotiation, right? We always end up with stuff that is in neither the House nor the Senate bill. And thinking about the size and shape of that stealth bomber is, and I call it a stealth bomber. I don't know if this makes sense to you guys, but look, it looks like a stealth bomber, right? It's got wings. It's got, here's the cockpit, whatever. So stealth bomber. But the stealth bomber is the portion of the bill the final bill that was in neither the House version nor the Senate version of the legislation. How big that of a component that is tells us quite a bit. But it's also really frustrating, right? Because we have these Senate procedures and these House procedures, and we think we kind of know what they are. But when we engage in this intercameral negotiation, and that can happen inside of a conference committee, that can happen outside of a conference committee, just shuffling bills back and forth. But a lot of that process is opaque. And it can be really frustrating. So Nebraska, for example, only has one chamber. And that's because George Norris, remember George Norris from way back when? George Norris was a legislator in Nebraska, and he realized that this conferencing process introduced all sorts of opportunities for people to plug things in to bills. Because when we shuffle things back and forth, it introduces a lack of transparency, some opacity. And so he thought it was a place where a lot of corruption was happening, and a lot of other progressives agreed, and they said, there's an easy way to resolve this problem, and that is just get rid of the upper chamber. We just need a lower chamber, and then we don't have to have this opaque negotiation between the House and Senate where we end up with a lot of different things. George Norris wasn't alone. This sort of hero of progressivism in the early 20th century wasn't alone in being concerned about how this negotiation unfolds in ways that distorts outcomes. Ronald Reagan was famous for a lot of reasons, but he famously said that when you go into a conference committee, you start off with an apple and an orange going in, and then what you get back is a pear. And we want to avoid that. We want to avoid going into a situation, Ronald Reagan said, where we get something totally different from what both the House and Senate agreed or thought we should see. What he thought we should see is some hybrid of an apple and an orange. But in fact, what we end up seeing is, depending on the bill, a stealth bomber that looks very different from the rest of what we had when we started. Negotiation, this endgame process is really influential. It's really important. And thinking about how the House relates to the Senate and how the Senate relates to the House has been the topic of our discussion for the last couple of videos. The bottom line for this is, while I think a lot of scholarship and a lot of our focus, and a lot of what your book focuses on, frankly, the text, is focused on what's happening within the House or what happens within the Senate and comparing and contrasting that. But it's in those contrasts and those comparisons that we end up seeing sort of really important ways that legislation actually gets formed. And it is always the case that the House is thinking about what the Senate will do, and the Senate is thinking about what the House will do. And that is conditioning a lot of what we see in those initial offers, a lot of what we're seeing in those initial negotiations. And so we can't really think of these two things in isolation. We have to think about them together. So we've tried to do that over the last couple of videos. I've enjoyed talking to you about it. And it's unsatisfying to get to the end and say, we don't know, but this is what political science is for. So we're going to continue to think about this as political scientists. I would love to know if you've got questions about this or you've got ideas about ways to think about this. Like I said, this is something that I think about and write about quite a bit. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, either on Slack or I didn't post any extra readings for this week. You're welcome. But this is an important piece of how procedure influences outcomes in both the House and the Senate. I appreciate you being with me today. I'm grateful that you stuck through this week. I hope this relatively short video is a relief. I look forward to seeing you next time.